Welcome to Whispering Willow Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fog came to Baker Street, as it always did in November, thick and purposeful, wrapping itself around gas lamps like a secret too heavy to keep. It pressed against window panes with the persistence of an uninvited guest, and the yellow glow of the lamps fought back with all the determination of candles at a wake. Inside number 221B, the fire crackled softly in the grate, sending shadows dancing across the cluttered sitting room, where books leaned against each other like old friends, sharing confidences, and the scent of pipe tobacco mingled with the faint mustiness of well-worn leather. Dr. John Watson sat in his chair, the one that had moulded itself to his shape over countless evenings, and listened to the city breathe beyond the walls. London in the 1890s was a creature of contradictions, grand and squalid, brilliant and brutal, a sprawling testament to an empire that believed itself invincible, even as its streets groaned under the weight of too many souls seeking too little fortune. The fog was democratic in its obscurity, hiding the soot-stained faces of crossing sweepers and the polished carriages of gentlemen with equal indifference. Watson had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Baker Street, the way the evening settled like sediment in a glass, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional clatter of hooves on cobblestones or the distant cry of a vendor closing shop. Tonight, though, there was something else. A tension in the air, perhaps, or merely the prescience that comes from living alongside a man who attracts mysteries the way lampposts attract moths. Sherlock Holmes stood at the window, his tall, lean figure backlit by the struggling gaslight outside, one hand pressed against the cold glass as if he could feel the city's pulse through the pane. He had been silent for nearly an hour, which, Watson knew, could mean either deep contemplation or profound boredom. With Holmes, the two states were often indistinguishable, until some small catalyst tipped the balance toward action. "The fog is thicker tonight," Watson offered, more to break the silence than from any meteorological insight. Holmes murmured, not turning from the window. "Visibility less than 10 feet, I should say. The perfect evening for secrets to move about unmolested." Watson smiled slightly. His friend had a way of making even weather sound conspiratorial. He returned his attention to the medical journal in his deep lap, though he found himself reading the same paragraph about advances in antiseptic surgery for the third time. The words swam together, refusing to lodge in his mind, and he realized he was waiting, though for what he couldn't say. The knock, when it came, was so soft that Watson almost missed it. Not the confident rap of a client with a straightforward case, nor the urgent hammering of Scotland Yard in crisis. This was tentative, almost apologetic, the sound of knuckles against wood that had rehearsed the gesture and found it wanting. Holmes turned from the window with such swift precision that Watson knew he had been expecting it. "Our evening's entertainment arrives," he said, and there was something in his voice. Not quite satisfaction, not quite unease, that made Watson set aside his journal and straighten in his chair. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps creaked on the stairs, her pace measured and unhurried. She had long since ceased to be startled by the odd hours and odder visitors that 221B attracted. The door opened, and she stood framed in the threshold, her face composed in that expression of professional neutrality she had perfected over years of admitting everyone from cabinet ministers to common thieves. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, and Watson noted the slight hesitation before the word gentleman, as if she weren't entirely convinced of its accuracy. "He says it's urgent, but won't give his name." Holmes made a small gesture with his hand, the graceful economy of movement that served as his invitation. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson. I suspect names are the least of what he's reluctant to share." The landlady withdrew, and in the brief interval before their visitor appeared, Watson found himself studying Holmes with renewed attention. His friend's face had taken on that peculiar quality of stillness that preceded great activity, like the moment before a storm when even the birds fall silent. Whatever Holmes had deduced from that hesitant knock, it had engaged his interest in a way that boded well for the evening's distraction, and poorly for someone's peace of mind. The man who entered moved as if he were wading through water, each step requiring conscious effort. He was perhaps 40, though the lines around his eyes suggested either older age or harder living. His clothes spoke of a gentleman's income. The cut of his coat was recent, the silk of his cravat unstained, but they hung on him with the awkwardness of garments donned without attention, as if dressing had been a task completed by muscle memory, while the mind was elsewhere entirely. What struck Watson most, however, was the man's hands. They trembled visibly, and he kept them thrust deep in his pockets, as if to hide their betrayal. When he removed his hat, a fine thing, Beaver felt, the sort that cost more than a clerk earned in a month, his fingers fumbled the gesture, and Holmes, with uncharacteristic courtesy, stepped forward to relieve him of it. "Please," Holmes said, gesturing to the chair opposite Watson's, "sit before you fall. You've come some distance in weather unsuited to walking, and you've been standing outside our door for—" he glanced at the window, "7 minutes, debating whether to knock at all." The visitor started slightly and sank into the offered chair with the gratitude of a man whose legs had been threatening mutiny. "How did you—" he began, then stopped himself with a short, bitter laugh. "No, forgive me. I was told you were observant. I should not be surprised." "The hem of your trousers is soaked to the knee," Holmes said, settling into his own chair and steepling his fingers in that characteristic pose, which happens only with prolonged exposure to this evening's particular fog. "Your boots, while of good quality, show scuff marks on the toes consistent with pacing, and there is a small crescent of condensation on the window, shoulder height, where someone of your build stood close enough to peer in, but not quite close enough to touch." Watson watched their visitor process this, saw the moment when explanation transformed from the supernatural to the merely acute, and nodded to himself. It was a sequence he had witnessed countless times, the deflation of mystery into method, the strange comfort people took in knowing Holmes's genius was, after all, grounded in observation, rather than omniscience. "You are correct," the man said quietly. "I have been reluctant. What I've come to discuss is not easily spoken of. It touches on matters of honor and death, and things done in darkness that the light may judge harshly." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes sharp with interest. then you have come to precisely the right place. Baker Street has heard many confessions whispered in the shadows, and the night keeps secrets better than the day. Tell me what weighs on you, and we shall see if it can be lightened." The visitor's hands emerged from his pockets at last, and Watson saw that one of them clutched something, a piece of paper, or what remained of one. It was perhaps 3 inches square, the edges blackened and curled by fire, the surface marked with what might have been writing, though the char had rendered it nearly illegible. "3 of us," the man began, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the fog itself might carry his words to unwelcome ears. "3 friends, we thought ourselves. We made a pact, you see. A foolish, drunken thing, born of wine and rage and the particular madness that seizes men when they believe themselves beyond consequence." He paused, and Watson found himself leaning forward despite himself, drawn by the raw pain in the man's voice. Outside, the fog pressed closer, and somewhere distant, a church bell tolled the hour. 8 slow, solemn notes that seemed to mark more than just the passage of time. "2 of them are dead now," the visitor continued, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. "Died within a fortnight of each other, in circumstances that the police have ruled accidental and self-inflicted. But I know better. I know because of this." He extended the burnt scrap toward Holmes, with a hand that trembled so violently the paper rattled like autumn leaves. Holmes took it with the delicate care of a man handling a butterfly's wing, carrying it to the lamp where the light could interrogate what remained of its message. Watson rose and joined him, peering over his shoulder at the fragment. The paper had been good quality once, linen fibre, he thought, the sort used for important correspondence or legal documents. The fire had eaten away most of it, but what remained showed traces of handwriting, 3 distinct hands, unless Watson missed his guess, and something else. Symbols, perhaps, or decorative flourishes, hard to distinguish in the char. "Tell me about the pact," Holmes said, not looking up from his examination. His voice had taken on that distant quality that meant his mind was already racing ahead, constructing theories from insufficient data and waiting for facts to catch up. The visitor drew a shaky breath. "We met at the Criterion, the 3 of us, myself, Edmund Blackwood, and Nicholas Ashford, old friends from university days, though we drifted as men do when life scatters them to different quarters of the city. Edmund had called the meeting, said he had something of importance to discuss. We dined well, drank better, and when the brandy had loosened our tongues sufficiently, he told us his purpose." He paused again, and Watson saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed against what might have been nausea, or simply the difficulty of confession. There was a man, you see, a man who had wronged each of us, in different ways and different times, but wronged us none the less. Edmund spoke of him with such cold fury that it sobered me despite the wine. And then Nicholas joined in, adding his own grievance, and I found myself speaking as well, giving voice to something I had buried for years. Holmes set down the burnt paper with careful precision and turned to face their visitor fully. And this pact, what was its nature? To confront this man? To seek redress through official channels? Or something less orthodox? The silence that followed was answer enough. Watson felt his stomach tighten with understanding. In his years with Holmes, he had encountered many shades of crime and desperation, but there was something particularly chilling about premeditated harm, dressed in the language of justice and sealed with the ceremony of friendship. "We wrote it down," the visitor said finally. "All of us, our names and our intentions." Edmund had candles, 3 white candles, he said, for purity of purpose, though I see now the bitter irony in that. We signed the paper by that candlelight, and Edmund kept it, said it was insurance that none of us would falter or betray the others. "And then?" Holmes prompted gently. "And then we went our separate ways. Edmund said he would contact us when the time was right, when he'd arranged matters to ensure our safety. But the time never came. 2 weeks ago, Edmund was struck by a hansom cab while crossing Regent Street. The driver swore he came out of nowhere, as if he hadn't looked before stepping into traffic. They said his mind must have been elsewhere, that it was a tragic accident." Watson saw the man's jaw clench, the muscle jumping beneath the skin. "And a week ago, Nicholas was found in his rooms. The pistol was in his hand, the note on the table. They said he had been despondent, that his finances were in disarray. But Nicholas was always in disarray. It was his natural state. He wouldn't. Holmes returned to his chair and sat with that preternatural stillness that meant his mind was cataloguing every word, every gesture, filing them away in the vast archives of his memory. "But you believe otherwise. You believe their deaths weren't accidental, not self-inflicted. You believe someone knew of your pact and has begun executing a different sort of justice." "I believe," the visitor said, and his voice cracked on the word, "that I am the last one left. And I believe that whoever has killed my friends will not rest until our pact has been completed in whatever twisted fashion they have devised." The fire popped in the grate, sending sparks against the screen, and Watson jumped slightly, despite himself. The room had grown colder, it seemed, or perhaps it was merely the chill of the man's conviction that seeped into his bones. He looked at Holmes and saw his friend's face set in those sharp, hawk-like lines that meant he had scented the trail and would not rest until he had run it to ground. "This burnt paper," Holmes said, picking it up once more. "Where did you obtain it?" "It came to me yesterday, in an envelope, no return address, posted from somewhere in Whitechapel. Inside was this fragment, and nothing else. No note, no explanation. Just this reminder of what we had done, what we had planned, returned to me like a ghost." Holmes held the paper up to the lamp again, tilting it at different angles, and Watson could almost see the wheels of deduction turning behind those keen grey eyes. "The fire that damaged this was quite recent. You can tell by the brittleness of the char. And it was extinguished deliberately, I think, before it could consume the entire document. Someone wanted you to have just enough to remember, to fear, but not enough to understand fully." "But understand what?" the visitor asked, and the desperation in his voice was palpable. "What is there to understand beyond the obvious? We made a terrible pact, and now we are paying for it." Holmes set the paper down and turned to face the man fully, his expression unreadable. "The obvious, my dear sir, is almost always the wrong answer. Someone has gone to considerable trouble, first to obtain this document, then to partially destroy it, then to ensure its delivery to you specifically. That speaks not of simple revenge, but of something far more complex. Someone is telling you a story, and we have received only the first chapter." He rose and began to pace, his movements liquid and purposeful, a panther in a cage that existed only in his own mind. Tell me about the man you sought to harm, his name, his position, his relationship to each of you. Leave nothing out, no matter how trivial it may seem. The visitor's face had gone ashen, and Watson felt a pang of sympathy for him. Whatever sins he had contemplated in wine-soaked darkness, he was paying for them now in the cold light of consequence. But Holmes was right. There was more to this than met the eye, and if they were to prevent a third death, they needed every scrap of information, every thread that might lead them through the labyrinth. Outside, the fog continued its patient work, erasing the city one street at a time, and Baker Street settled deeper into the November night. In the sitting room at 221B, 3 men gathered around the failing fire, and one of them told a story of friendship and fury, of honour misplaced and vengeance deferred, while the clock on the mantel marked the hours with the indifference of all timepieces, caring nothing for the dramas that unfolded in its presence. And somewhere in London, in the vast anonymous sprawl of the greatest city the world had yet known, someone waited in the darkness with a patience that spoke of absolute conviction, holding the remaining pieces of a story that had not yet reached its final page. The telling would take hours, Watson knew. These things always did. But as he settled into his chair and prepared to listen, he found himself oddly grateful for the fog, for the way it muffled the world beyond their walls and made this room, with its books and its fire, and its 2 men dedicated to unravelling the threads of human darkness, feel like a sanctuary against the cold uncertainties that prowled outside. Holmes was right, of course. He almost always was. This was not a simple tale of crime and punishment. This was something stranger, more layered, a puzzle box whose solution would require them to question every assumption about guilt and innocence, about fate and agency, about the stories men tell themselves to justify the unjustifiable. But that would come later. For now, there was only the voice of their visitor, threading through the quiet room like smoke, and the burnt fragment of paper that held secrets the flames had tried and failed to keep. Morning came to Baker Street with the reluctance of an actor taking the stage after a poor rehearsal. The fog had thinned, but not departed, lingering in the corners and alleys like a guest who couldn't take a hint. And the November sun, what little of it penetrated London's perpetual veil of coal smoke and cloud, painted everything in shades of grey and amber. It was the sort of light that made one question whether night had truly ended or merely paused to catch its breath. Watson woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Holmes moving about the sitting room with that peculiar energy that meant he had not slept at all. This was not unusual. Holmes treated sleep the way other men treated unnecessary correspondence, as something to be dealt with only when absolutely required, and never a moment sooner. Watson had long since ceased trying to impose normal human rhythms on his friend's peculiar metabolism. He dressed slowly, his body reminding him that he was no longer the young army surgeon who had charged about Afghanistan with more enthusiasm than sense. The wound in his leg, though healed these many years, always spoke up in cold weather, a kind of meteorological commentary that he had learned to interpret as accurately as any barometer. Today it whispered of rain coming, and possibly of spending too long in chairs, listening to confessions that stretched past midnight. Their visitor had finally departed around 2 a.m, and Watson had caught perhaps 4 hours of fitful sleep, punctuated by dreams of burning paper, and 3 men gathered around candles that cast no shadows. Now, descending the 17 steps from his bedroom to the sitting room, he had counted them once during a particularly boring case, and the number had lodged in his mind with the permanence of all useless information. He found Holmes exactly where he expected. At the chemistry table, surrounded by beakers and retorts, the burnt fragment of paper mounted on a slide beneath his microscope. "Coffee on the sideboard," Holmes said without looking up. "Mrs. Hudson has outdone herself this morning. I believe she sensed we were embarking on something significant, and has provided sustenance accordingly." Watson poured himself a cup and discovered that Holmes was correct. Their landlady had indeed intuited the situation and had supplemented the usual breakfast with bacon, eggs, toast, and what appeared to be her excellent marmalade, the one made with Seville oranges that she reserved for special occasions or particularly trying cases. He prepared a plate and settled into his chair, giving Holmes the silence he knew his friend required when conducting examinations. The sitting room looked different in daylight, though no less cluttered. Watson had tried, in the early days of their association, to impose some order on Holmes's chaos, but had long since accepted that his friend's mind required physical surroundings that matched its own labyrinthine organization. Papers and monographs formed precarious towers on every flat surface. Chemical apparatus competed for space with tobacco experiments, and the Persian slipper that served as Holmes's tobacco pouch dangled from the mantel with the insouciance of an item that had forgotten its original purpose and decided to become decorative instead. 3 distinct hands, Holmes announced suddenly, still peering through the microscope. As our visitor suggested, the first, presumably Edmund Blackwood's, as he was the instigator, shows a certain flourish, the confident strokes of a man accustomed to signing important documents. The second, likely Nicholas Ashford's, is more cramped, the writing of someone who spent long hours at a desk under poor light. Our visitor's hand, he gave his name as Thomas Weatherby, incidentally, though I note he waited until he was leaving to share that particular detail, is educated but hurried, the script of a man who thinks faster than his pen can follow. Watson sipped his coffee and waited. Holmes would arrive at his point eventually, though the route might wind through several apparently unrelated observations first. "But there's a 4th hand," Holmes continued, and now he did look up, his grey eyes bright with that peculiar intensity that meant he had found something genuinely interesting. Faint, nearly illegible, even before the fire damaged the paper, but definitely present. Someone else wrote on this document, either before or after the 3 men signed it. A single line, perhaps 2, in the upper margin where the flames were most thorough. He rose and crossed to the window, holding the fragment up to the uncertain light. "I have applied every chemical test at my disposal, used oblique lighting and magnification, and can make out only fragments. The word all, that much is certain, and possibly same or shame. The letters are ambiguous. And what might be man or men?" Watson set down his cup with a soft clink. Someone knew about their pact. Before it could be enacted, someone knew and... what? Warned them? Mocked them? Or, Holmes said quietly, returning to his chair and steepling his fingers in that characteristic gesture, revealed something they themselves did not know. Consider, Watson. 3 men meet in wine-soaked fury to plot against a common enemy. They sign their names in candlelight, sealing their intentions with ceremony and brandy. But what if they weren't as unique in their grievance as they believed? What if someone else knew that their target, their intended victim, had wronged not just 3 men, but more? The implications settled over the room like the fog outside, obscuring clear sight, and making Watson question what he thought he understood. "You're suggesting this 4th hand belongs to someone else who had reason to want this man dead?" "I'm suggesting," Holmes corrected, "that we are dealing with a situation far more complex than 3 friends and a vengeful spirit. The person who sent this fragment to Weatherby did so for a reason. They wanted him to see it, to remember, but also to understand something that the fire conveniently obscured. It's rather like sending someone a torn map with the destination missing. You remind them they were travelling, but ensure they cannot complete the journey." Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded on the stairs, her particular rhythm punctuated by what sounded like someone ascending behind her. Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally. He had been expecting something then, though he had characteristically neglected to inform Watson of this expectation. "Inspector Lestrade to see you, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson announced, and there was the faintest note of disapproval in her voice. She had never quite forgiven the Scotland Yard man for tracking mud into her hallway during the business of the Norwood builder, though that had been 2 years past, and the carpet long since replaced. Lestrade entered with the air of a man who knew he was about to ask for help he'd rather not need. He was, Watson had always thought, rather like a terrier, small, tenacious, and occasionally prone to digging up things better left buried. His face was weathered by too many years walking London streets in all weather, and his eyes held the particular weariness of a man who had seen every variety of human weakness, and had ceased being surprised by any of them. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, nodding to each in turn. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, and Watson heard the note of satisfaction in his voice. "Your timing is, as always, impeccable. You've come about the deaths of Edmund Blackwood and Nicholas Ashford, and you've come because someone at the Yard has finally noticed that 2 men dying within a fortnight, both of whom were present at the same dinner a week before the first death, stretches the bounds of coincidence somewhat far." Lestrade's face performed an impressive series of expressions: surprise, resignation, and a kind of rueful acknowledgement that he should have known better than to think he could surprise Sherlock Holmes. "You've already heard, then. I have been made aware of the situation, yes, and I suspect you've come because the official conclusions, accidental death and suicide, sit uneasily in your stomach, much like Mrs. Hudson's excellent kippers when consumed too quickly." The inspector settled into the chair that their visitor had occupied the night before, and Watson noted that he sat with the same heaviness, as if he carried weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. The Blackwood case was closed quickly, too quickly, perhaps. The hansom driver was credible. There were witnesses who confirmed the man stepped directly into traffic without looking, and there was no evidence of foul play. But, Holmes prompted. "But Edmund Blackwood was a solicitor, Mr. Holmes, a careful man by profession and by nature. His clerk told me that Blackwood had a positive mania about crossing streets, would wait for carriages to pass even when they were 100 yards distant. Said his father had been killed by a runaway horse, and he'd never forgotten it. Yet, on that day, he apparently walked directly in front of a hansom travelling at full speed, in broad daylight, on Regent Street, where the traffic is always heavy. Holmes's fingers drummed once against the arm of his chair, a sign of interest, Watson knew, though most people would have missed the gesture entirely. And Nicholas Ashford? Suicide, according to the coroner. Pistol shot to the temple, powder burns consistent with close range, note on the table expressing despondency over his financial circumstances. His landlady confirmed he'd been withdrawn, possibly depressed. The pistol was his own, legally owned. Everything pointed to self-destruction. Except, Watson ventured, because there was clearly an except hovering in the air like the fog outside. Lestrade pulled a notebook from his pocket and flipped it open with the practiced gesture of a man who had written down so many facts that the motion had become automatic. Except that Nicholas Ashford was left-handed, Dr. Watson. His landlady confirmed it, his friends confirmed it, and yet the pistol was found in his right hand. When I pointed this out to the coroner, he suggested that perhaps in his final moments Ashford had fumbled, or that I was making complications where none existed. The coroner, Holmes observed dryly, is paid to provide conclusions, not complications. Death by misadventure and suicide are neat categories that close cases and clear dockets. Murder, on the other hand, requires investigation, resources, and the possibility that the perpetrator might never be found, all things that reflect poorly on official statistics. Lestrade had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he didn't argue. The politics of Scotland Yard were Byzantine at best, and Watson had gathered over the years that Lestrade occupied an uncomfortable position, competent enough to be given difficult cases, but not senior enough to push back against conclusions preferred by his superiors. "There's more," Lestrade continued. "I spoke with Ashford's banker. Informally, you understand. Nothing official. The man's finances were in disarray, yes, but no worse than they'd been for years. He lived beyond his means, but not catastrophically so. And 3 days before his death, he deposited a substantial sum, £500, into his account. When I asked where it came from, the banker said it was a bank draft from an account he couldn't identify. Foreign, possibly, or held under a company name." Holmes leaned forward, and Watson recognized the posture. His friend was no longer merely interested. He was engaged, his formidable intellect already constructing frameworks to hold these pieces of information. £500, payment or bribe, reward or blackmail? Did Ashford receive this money for something he had done, or to ensure he would not do something he had planned? "I don't know, Mr. Holmes, and that's why I'm here, because officially these cases are closed. Officially, I have no reason to be investigating anything, but unofficially—" He paused, and Watson saw genuine concern cross his weathered features. "Unofficially, I don't believe in this many coincidences. 2 men, friends, dying within 2 weeks, both deaths convenient and tidy, and just ambiguous enough that questions can be dismissed as overthinking. It smells wrong." "Your instincts serve you well, Inspector," Holmes said, rising to pace before the fireplace. "Though I suspect the situation is even more complex than you imagine. Tell me, in your investigation of these men, did you uncover any connection between them beyond simple friendship? Any shared business venture, any common enemy, any thread that bound them together beyond the accident of university acquaintance?" Lestrade consulted his notebook again, flipping through pages with the slight frown of a man reviewing information that had seemed insignificant at the time, but might now prove vital. Nothing concrete. Blackwood was a solicitor, as I said, with a respectable practice in Chancery Lane. Ashford worked for an import firm. Tea and spices, primarily. They moved in different circles, lived in different parts of the city. The only connection I could find was their friendship and the fact that they both belonged to the same club, the Athenaeum, though they were hardly regular attendees. And did your investigation extend to their families, their personal lives, their histories, before London claimed them? Not extensively, no. Once the deaths were ruled accidental and self-inflicted, there seemed little point in... Lestrade stopped, reading correctly the expression on Holmes's face. You think there's something there? I think, Holmes said, that three men do not meet to dine together after years of drift unless something significant prompts the reunion. I think that men do not die conveniently within fortnight of each other unless someone has taken a hand in arranging their departures. And I think that a solicitor who fears traffic and a left-handed man holding a pistol in his right hand suggest that someone has been very clever about manufacturing accidents and suicides that will satisfy cursory investigation, but not careful scrutiny. He turned to face Lestrade fully, and Watson saw that sharp, predatory focus that meant Holmes had scented the trail and would not rest until he had run it to ground. There is a third man, Inspector, Thomas Weatherby. He was at that dinner. He was part of whatever bound these three together. And if I am correct in my deductions, he is in considerably more danger than he realizes. Lestrade's pen was already moving across the page. Where can I find him? That, Holmes said, is what we must discover. He came to me last night in fear for his life, but was decidedly vague about his current accommodations. He claimed to have moved 3 times in the past week, and I suspect he has moved again since leaving here. A man that frightened does not remain stationary. But you can find him. It was not a question. Lestrade had worked with Holmes long enough to know that when the detective set his mind to locating someone in London, the city's vastness became irrelevant. I can find him, Holmes confirmed, though it would help considerably if I knew more about what these 3 men had planned. Inspector, I need you to conduct another investigation. This time focusing not on how Blackwood and Ashford died, but on who they might have wanted dead. Look into their pasts, their grievances, their enemies. Look for a name that appears in connection with all 3 men, a thread that ties their histories together. You're suggesting they were planning a murder? Lestrade said flatly. I'm suggesting they were planning something that someone else found inconvenient. Whether that something was murder, exposure, or some other form of justice, formal or otherwise, remains to be determined. But 3 men met, 3 men made plans, and now 2 men are dead in circumstances carefully arranged to appear innocent. The mathematics of that situation are rather suggestive, don't you think? Lestrade stood, tucking his notebook back into his pocket, with the air of a man who had come seeking confirmation of his suspicions and was leaving with more questions than answers. I'll see what I can uncover. But Mr. Holmes, if there is a 3rd victim being lined up, if Weatherby is in danger, then we must work quickly, Holmes finished. Which is why, Watson, you and I will be making several calls this afternoon. We need to understand what bound these 3 men together, what they planned, and who had sufficient reason to prevent them from carrying out their intentions. As Lestrade descended the stairs, Watson found himself studying the burnt fragment of paper that lay on the table, its blackened edges curling like the petals of a flower dying in reverse. 3 men had signed this document, had committed their intentions to paper and sealed them with candlelight, believing themselves bound by friendship and common purpose. But someone else had known. Someone had added that mysterious fourth hand, those few words that the flames had so conveniently obscured, and that someone had systematically begun erasing the conspirators, making each death appear natural, accidental, the sort of tragedy that happened in a city as vast and indifferent as London. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows with patient persistence, and somewhere in the labyrinth of streets and alleys, Thomas Weatherby was hiding, moving from lodging to lodging like a fox before hounds, not knowing that the hunter had already chosen him, and was merely waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Holmes was right, Watson thought. This was no simple matter of revenge or prevention. This was something far more complex, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered across years and lives, connected by threads invisible to casual observation but clear as daylight to someone who knew how to look. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot. And somewhere in London, in the grey November morning, the pieces were already moving toward their appointed positions, driven by a logic that none of them yet understood, but all of them would soon discover. The afternoon found Holmes and Watson threading their way through London's arteries like blood cells navigating a particularly congested vein. The fog had thinned to a persistent mist that clung to clothing and dampened spirits with equal efficiency, and the streets were thick with the usual commerce of a city that never quite stopped moving. Vendors calling their wares, crossing sweepers darting between carriages, newsboys shouting headlines that promised scandal and delivered disappointment, and everywhere the great democratic mass of humanity that made London both magnificent and insufferable in equal measure. Their destination was the Criterion, the establishment where Thomas Weatherby and his companions had gathered for that fateful dinner. Holmes had chosen to walk rather than take a cab, which Watson knew meant his friend was thinking, organizing the facts they possessed, arranging them in patterns, discarding theories that didn't fit, and constructing new ones from the fragments that remained. Holmes's mind worked best in motion, as if the physical act of walking somehow lubricated the gears of deduction. They crossed Piccadilly Circus, where the statue of Eros presided over the chaos with the bemused expression of a deity who had long since given up trying to impose order on his worshippers. The Criterion occupied a prominent position, its facade speaking of respectability, and its interior promising the sort of discreet indulgence that Victorian gentlemen prized. Good food, better wine, and the assurance that what was discussed over brandy would remain between the walls that heard it. Inside, the air was thick with the competing aromas of tobacco, roasted meat, and the particular mustiness that accumulated in any establishment where velvet drapes and leather upholstery absorbed decades of conversation. The lighting was deliberately subdued. Gas lamps turned low, creating pools of amber warmth in a sea of comfortable shadow. It was the sort of place where secrets felt natural, where confidences could be exchanged without the harsh judgment of daylight. Holmes approached the maître d'hôtel with the sort of confident familiarity that suggested he had been there countless times, though Watson knew for a fact this was his first visit. It was a talent his friend possessed, the ability to belong anywhere simply by acting as if he did. The maître d', a man whose imperious bearing suggested he had been born in evening dress and would be buried in it, regarded Holmes with the professional neutrality of one who had learned not to judge patrons by their appearance alone. "Good afternoon," Holmes said, and Watson noted how his voice had taken on a slightly different quality. Still his own, but with the faint polish of someone accustomed to dining in establishments that didn't display prices on their menus. "I wonder if you might assist me. I'm making inquiries about a dinner party held here approximately 3 weeks ago. 3 gentlemen, Edmund Blackwood, Nicholas Ashford, and Thomas Weatherby. They would have taken a private room, I imagine, and ordered rather extensively from your wine list." The maitre d's expression flickered. Not quite recognition, but something close to it, like a man remembering a tune he couldn't quite name. "I recall the occasion, sir, though I must say it's unusual for inquiries to be made about private dining arrangements. Our discretion is one of our most valued services." Holmes produced a card, not his own, Watson noticed with interest, but one that bore an official-looking crest and some impressive-sounding title that Watson couldn't quite read from his angle. "I appreciate your discretion, naturally. However, 2 of those gentlemen are now deceased, and certain questions have arisen that require clarification. I'm sure you understand that in such circumstances discretion must occasionally yield to necessity." The maitre d' studied the card with the air of a man who had seen enough forged credentials to spot the genuine article, and apparently found this one satisfactory. His posture relaxed fractionally, though his expression remained professionally neutral. "A tragedy, sir. Mr. Blackwood was a regular patron, always courteous, always prompt with his settlements. I was shocked to read of his accident." "And the dinner itself? Do you recall any details?" "They arrived at 7, requested the Marlborough Room, one of our smaller private spaces suitable for intimate gatherings. Mr. Blackwood had reserved it in advance and specified that they were not to be disturbed, except when summoned. They ordered the prix-fixe menu, and—" He paused, consulting some internal ledger that existed only in his remarkable memory. 3 bottles of your Chateau Margaux, followed by brandy. Quite a substantial amount of brandy, if I recall correctly. Watson could imagine it. 3 men gathering in that private room, the walls lined with dark wood panelling that absorbed sound and kept secrets. The table laid with white linen and silver that caught the gaslight and threw it back in soft gleams. The wine flowing, the conversation building, inhibitions eroding like cliffs before a patient tide, until the words that had been held back came tumbling out in a rush of alcohol-fueled honesty. "How long did they remain?" Holmes asked, and Watson recognized the casual tone that meant the question was anything but casual. "Until after midnight, sir. Quite late for a weeknight, though not unprecedented among gentlemen who are enjoying themselves. I remember, because young Martin, one of our waiters, mentioned that they had called for candles. White candles, specifically. We don't typically provide candles in the private rooms, you understand, as the gaslighting is more than adequate. But Mr. Blackwood insisted." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest, though his voice remained merely curious. "White candles? How many?" 3, sir. Martin thought it an odd request, but fulfilled it none the less. When he brought them, he said the gentlemen were animated, discussing something with great intensity, though he couldn't hear specifics as they lowered their voices when he entered. And when they departed, was their demeanour notable in any way? The maitre d' permitted himself a slight smile, the expression of a man who had seen countless gentlemen leave in various states of inebriation and had learned to be diplomatic about it. They were in good spirits, sir. Perhaps slightly unsteady, but nothing unseemly. They shook hands quite formally at the door. I remember that, as if they had just concluded some important piece of business rather than merely sharing a meal. Holmes nodded slowly, and Watson could almost see the pieces clicking into place in his friend's mind. This waiter, Martin, is he available? I should like to speak with him, if possible. Within moments, a young man appeared from the back regions of the restaurant, wiping his hands on his apron with the nervous energy of someone unaccustomed to being summoned for conversation with patrons. He was perhaps 20, with the thin, wiry build of someone who spent long hours on their feet, and the sharp eyes of one who learned to read moods and anticipate needs for the sake of better tips. "Martin," Holmes said, and his voice had shifted again, becoming warmer, more approachable, the tone of someone speaking to an equal rather than a subordinate. "I understand you attended to 3 gentlemen in the Marlborough Room some weeks ago. I'm hoping you might remember some details about their evening." Martin glanced at the maitre d', received a nearly imperceptible nod of permission, and turned back to Holmes with the air of someone navigating potentially treacherous waters. "I remember them, sir. It was an unusual evening." "Unusual how?" "Well, sir, it started normally enough. 3 gentlemen, well-dressed, polite. They ordered dinner and wine, and I served them as usual. But as the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the room changed. When I brought the second bottle of wine, they were laughing. That sort of loud, loose laughter that comes with drink. But by the time I brought the brandy, they'd gone quiet, intense-like, speaking in low voices, leaning across the table toward each other. "And the candles?" Holmes prompted gently. "That was the strangest part, sir. Mr. Blackwood. I knew him by sight, he'd been here before. Called me over and asked specifically for white candles. Not just any candles, mind you, but white ones. Said it was important, though he didn't explain why. I had to go down to the storage to find them, as we don't keep such things readily available." Martin paused, his brow furrowing with the effort of recollection. "When I returned with them, I knocked before entering, as I always do, but they didn't respond. Immediately, I could hear them speaking, something about swearing, about making certain. Those were the words I caught, swearing and making certain. When I finally entered, they'd gone silent, all 3 watching me like I'd interrupted something sacred. Watson found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the young waiter's narrative. There was something in his telling, the earnestness of it, the specific details that carried the weight of truth. This was not a man embellishing for effect. This was someone genuinely puzzled by what he had witnessed. "I lit the candles for them," Martin continued, "and placed them in the center of the table. Mr. Blackwood thanked me and said they would ring when they required anything further. But as I was leaving, I glanced back. I shouldn't have. It's not professional. But curiosity got the better of me. And I saw them all leaning toward those candles, their faces lit from below. And Mr. Blackwood was holding up what looked like a piece of paper." "Could you see what was written on it?" Holmes asked, though Watson could tell from his tone that he already knew the answer. "No, sir. I was too far away, and the light was poor, except directly around the candles. But I saw all 3 of them lean in close, saw them each produce pens. They must have brought them specifically. as we don't provide writing materials in the dining rooms. And then they were writing, taking turns, passing the paper between them. And after that, Martin's expression grew more uncertain, as if he were questioning his own memory. After that, they rang for more brandy, and when I brought it, the mood had changed again. They were subdued, almost solemn. The paper was gone. I don't know where they put it, and the candles were burning low. They sat there for perhaps another hour, drinking slowly, speaking occasionally in voices too quiet for me to hear. And then they left, and I remember thinking it was one of the oddest dinner parties I'd ever served. Holmes produced a coin, far more generous than the information warranted, Watson noted, and pressed it into Martin's hand. "You've been most helpful. One final question. When you cleared the room after they left, did you notice anything unusual? Anything left behind, any marks on the table, anything at all that seemed out of place?" The young waiter pocketed the coin with practiced ease and thought for a moment. "The candles had burned down completely, sir, just pools of wax on the table, which took some effort to clean. And there were drops of red wax as well, which was odd because I'd brought them white candles. It looked almost like—" He paused, seeming to realize how fanciful his observation might sound. "It looked almost like blood, sir, red drops scattered among the white wax." After they had thanked the maitre d' and stepped back out into the misty afternoon, Watson found himself trying to assemble what they had learned into some coherent picture. 3 men, gathering in secret to seal some pact with candlelight and signatures, sharing their grievances and their intentions over wine and brandy until their resolve hardened into something resembling determination. And then, what? Had they truly intended to go through with it, whatever it was? Or had the morning's sobriety dissolved their wine-soaked courage? "Red wax," Holmes murmured as they walked, more to himself than to Watson. "Now that is interesting. They brought white candles, symbolic, one assumes, of purity of purpose, or some such ceremonial nonsense. But someone also had red wax, used it deliberately to seal their document, perhaps, giving their pact the appearance of something more binding, more official. A bit theatrical, don't you think?" Watson observed. "Extremely theatrical. But then, men making pacts to commit murder, or whatever they were planning, often are. They convince themselves they are heroes. In some grand narrative, knights errant seeking justice that the law has failed to provide. The ceremony, the candles, the formal signatures, all of it helps transform what is essentially criminal intent into something that feels noble, justified, even necessary." They had reached the address that Lestrade had provided for Edmund Blackwood's chambers, a respectable building in Chancery Lane where solicitors and barristers maintained their professional premises. The building was 5 stories of soot-stained brick, with windows that stared out at the street like tired eyes, and a brass plaque by the door that listed a dozen names in order of seniority, Blackwood's appearing near the middle. Inside they were directed to the 2nd floor by a clerk whose sole purpose seemed to be to sit at a desk and radiate disapproval at anyone who disturbed the building's ecclesiastical quiet. Blackwood's chambers consisted of 2 rooms, an outer office where a secretary would have worked, and an inner sanctum where the solicitor himself would have conducted his affairs. The rooms had been locked since Blackwood's death, and Holmes had procured a key through means Watson knew better than to inquire about. The door swung open with a creak that sounded unnaturally loud in the silent corridor, and they stepped into what felt like a tomb, not because of any morbid decoration, but because of the absolute stillness, the sense of a space frozen in time, at the moment its occupant had stepped out, never to return. The outer office was utilitarian: desk, filing cabinets, typewriter, the tools of legal administration, arranged with the precision of someone who valued efficiency. But the inner office revealed more of the man. Books lined the walls, legal texts primarily, but also history and philosophy, suggesting a mind that ranged beyond mere precedents and case law. A photograph on the desk showed a younger Blackwood with an older man who shared his features. The father, Watson guessed, the one killed by a runaway horse whose death had given Blackwood his peculiar fear of traffic. Holmes moved through the space like a ghost himself, touching nothing but observing everything, his eyes cataloguing details with the precision of a camera capturing light. He paused before the desk, studying the surface. Blotter, pen stand, a small bronze statue of Themis holding her scales of justice. He was methodical, Holmes murmured, pulling open desk drawers with careful fingers. Everything in its place, everything organized. Not the sort of man who would step carelessly into traffic unless his mind was elsewhere. And even then, years of ingrained caution would have kept him safe. Unless what? Watson prompted. Unless he was not thinking about traffic at all. Unless his mind was so consumed by something else, fear, guilt, anticipation, that the automatic caution failed him. Or unless he believed he saw something, someone that required his immediate attention and caused him to forget his usual care. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of legal briefs, Holmes found a leather portfolio tied with string. He carried it to the desk and opened it carefully, revealing what appeared to be personal correspondence, letters, notes, documents that had nothing to do with legal matters and everything to do with Blackwood's private life. Watson watched as Holmes sorted through them, his long fingers moving with the delicacy of a surgeon, until he stopped, suddenly, extracting a single sheet of paper. It was a letter, written in a hand that Watson didn't recognize, dated 2 months before Blackwood's death. Holmes read it silently, his expression growing darker, and then passed it to Watson without comment. The letter was brief, unsigned, and chilling in its simplicity. I know what you intend. I know about the others. Do not think that distance or time or the bonds of friendship will protect you from consequence. Some debts can never be forgiven, some crimes never forgotten. You will all pay, each in turn, and the payment will be exact. Watson felt his breath catch. A threat. Someone knew about their plans. Someone knew, Holmes agreed, and someone acted. 2 men dead within a fortnight, and now we understand why. This letter makes clear that our mysterious correspondent had no intention of allowing their pact to come to fruition. But the question remains: who sent this? Who had both knowledge of their plans and sufficient reason to prevent them? He carefully replaced the letter in the portfolio and surveyed the office once more, as if hoping the walls might whisper their secrets. Blackwood kept this letter, which suggests he took the threat seriously. Yet, he did not go to the police, did not take any official action. Why? Because what he was planning was itself criminal. Or because he knew that the person threatening him had justification for their anger. The afternoon light was fading, pressing against the windows with the anemic persistence of November attempting to assert itself before surrendering to night. Watson thought about the young waiter's description. 3 men leaning toward candles, their faces lit from below like conspirators in a painting, signing something that they believed would bind them to action. And somewhere, someone watching, waiting, knowing that these 3 had signed not a pact, but a death warrant, their own. "We need to find Thomas Weatherby," Watson said quietly. If this letter was sent to Blackwood, the others likely received similar warnings. Weatherby is hiding not just because 2 of his friends are dead, but because he knows someone promised to make him pay, and that someone has proven quite capable of keeping their promises. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze distant, already calculating their next move. Indeed. But first, we need to understand who they were planning to kill, and why that person, or someone connected to them, would have sufficient reason and resources to hunt down 3 men and eliminate them one by one with such meticulous care. They locked the office behind them and descended the stairs, stepping back out into the London evening where fog and twilight were engaged in their nightly dance for dominance. Somewhere in this vast city, Thomas Weatherby was hiding, moving from room to room, looking over his shoulder, waiting for the knock that would announce his turn had come. And somewhere else, the author of that threatening letter was waiting too, patient as death itself, certain that all debts would be paid and all accounts settled, no matter how long it took or how carefully the debtors tried to hide. The game was growing darker, Watson thought, and the pieces were all moving toward some conclusion that none of them could yet see, but all of them could feel approaching with the inevitability of winter following autumn. Evening had claimed London entirely by the time Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, and with it came that particular quality of darkness that November specialized in. Not the clean black of a winter night, but a thick, textured obscurity that seemed to have substance, as if one could reach out and gather handfuls of shadow. The gas lamps fought their usual losing battle, creating islands of amber light in an ocean of gloom, and the sounds of the city took on that muffled quality that made everything seem both closer and more distant than it actually was. Mrs. Hudson had left a cold supper on the sideboard, chicken, bread, cheese, and a pot of tea that had long since surrendered any pretense of warmth, along with a note informing them that she had retired early with a headache, and would appreciate not being disturbed unless the building caught fire, or the Queen herself came calling. Holmes read this missive with a slight smile, and immediately set about making enough noise in his chemical corner to ensure that Mrs. Hudson would be reaching for her headache powders well into the night. Watson, having learned long ago that interrupting Holmes during his analytical work was futile at best and dangerous at worst, settled into his chair with the cold chicken and yesterday's newspaper. He found himself reading the same paragraph repeatedly, his mind refusing to focus on reports of parliamentary debates and society gossip, when upstairs his friend was conducting what amounted to an interrogation of a piece of burnt paper. Holmes had lit every lamp in the sitting room, transforming the space into something resembling a photographer's studio, all harsh light and deep shadow with no comfortable middle ground. He had mounted the fragment beneath his most powerful magnifying lens and was subjecting it to a battery of tests that involved various chemicals, powders, and techniques that Watson recognized from previous cases, but could not have named or explained if pressed. The clock on the mantel marked the passage of time with its usual indifference. 8:30, 9 o'clock, 9:30. While Holmes moved between his chemistry table and his microscope with the focused intensity of a priest performing some arcane ritual. Occasionally he would make a soft sound, not quite satisfaction, not quite frustration, and make a note in the leather-bound journal where he recorded his observations, in that cramped, nearly illegible hand that Watson had learned to decipher only through years of practice. Finally, around 10 o'clock, Holmes straightened from the microscope and rolled his shoulders with the air of a man who had been maintaining an uncomfortable position far too long. "Watson," he said, and his voice carried that note of subdued excitement that meant he had found something significant. "Come and see what our burnt testament has revealed." Watson set aside his newspaper, relieved, if he was honest, to abandon the pretense of reading it, and crossed to where Holmes stood. His friend gestured to the microscope, and Watson bent to peer through the eyepiece, though he had learned from experience that what Holmes saw through such instruments often remained stubbornly invisible to less trained observers. The fragment appeared larger under magnification, of course, and the burn marks that had seemed chaotic to the naked eye revealed patterns and textures that suggested intention rather than accident. Watson could make out the edges where flame had consumed the paper, could see how the fire had been applied not uniformly, but in specific areas, as if someone had held a match or candle to particular sections while protecting others. The fire was controlled, Holmes said, confirming Watson's observation. This document was not accidentally burnt and then rescued from the flames. Someone deliberately destroyed specific portions while preserving others. They wanted to obscure certain information while leaving just enough intact to be suggestive. He moved to his chemistry table and returned with a series of photographs he had taken of the fragment under different lighting conditions: natural light, gaslight, light filtered through various colored glass plates. Spreading them across his desk, he pointed to variations in the shadows and highlights that told a story Watson was only beginning to understand. "I have applied silver nitrate to reveal writing that the flames obscured," Holmes continued, selecting one particular photograph. "The heat causes chemical changes in the paper and ink that can sometimes be reversed or at least made visible through appropriate treatment. What we have here are fragments of 4 distinct sections of text written by 4 different hands." Watson leaned closer, squinting at the photograph where faint traces of writing had been coaxed back into visibility, like ghosts reluctantly manifesting. The letters were incomplete, maddeningly truncated, but Holmes had transcribed what he could discern onto a separate sheet in his neat, analytical hand. First hand, Blackwood. "Must swear by this candlelight to see justice done. The man who destroyed shall pay for his crimes with." Second hand, Ashford. "Bind myself to this purpose. No law will touch him, but we 3 his death will balance." Third hand, Weatherby. "Pledge my honour and my hand to this action. What was taken from us, restoration through." Fourth hand, Unknown. "All 3 seek the same man. All 3 plan the same death. All 3 are blind to." The 4th section ended there, the rest consumed by flame, or perhaps never written at all. Watson read through the transcription twice, feeling the weight of what these fragments revealed. 3 men, each pledging to kill someone they believed had wronged them. Each apparently unaware that the others harbored identical intentions toward the same target. And a 4th voice, an observer or participant who knew what the 3 did not. that their separate grievances had led them to a common enemy. "The irony is almost literary," Holmes observed, returning to his chair and steepling his fingers in that characteristic pose. "Three friends meet to seal a pact, each believing they are sharing their unique burden, only to discover, or have revealed to them, that their intended victim has managed to offend all three equally. It's rather like a play, don't you think? The sort of dramatic structure that would appeal to someone with a developed sense of theatre." "But who is this fourth person?" Watson asked, though he suspected Holmes had already formed theories. How did they know what the three were planning? And why add their own observation to the document rather than simply preventing the meeting from occurring? Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light that meant he was enjoying the puzzle, despite, or perhaps because of, its darker implications. As to how they knew, I would suggest that someone was present at the Criterion that evening, not in the Marlborough Room itself, but nearby, close enough to observe, perhaps to overhear fragments of conversation. When the door opened, or when voices were raised in wine-soaked passion, our mysterious fourth party added their observation to the document after the three had signed it, either while they were distracted by additional drinking or after they had departed entirely. He rose and began to pace, his movements fluid and purposeful, each step marking a point in his deduction. Consider the sequence. 3 men meet, seal their pact with ceremony and signatures, and depart believing their plan is secret and secure. But someone else, waiter, servant, or perhaps another patron who noticed their suspicious behavior, discovers what they have written. This person reads the document, realizes its significance, and makes a choice. Not to destroy it entirely, not to alert authorities, but to add their own observation, and then ensure that the document survives in a form that will eventually reveal the truth. "But why burn it at all?" Watson objected. "Why not simply keep it intact?" "Ah, but that's the genius of it, Watson. An intact document is evidence. It could be used in court, could implicate the writer themselves if they were involved in what followed. But a partially burnt document, sent anonymously to one of the conspirators after his companions have died, that becomes psychological warfare. It reminds Weatherby of what he planned, suggests that someone knows everything, but provides no concrete proof that could be used to seek official protection." Holmes returned to the photographs and selected another, this one showing the paper's watermark, a detail Watson had entirely missed. The paper itself tells a story. This is Basildon Bond, expensive stationery sold by only a handful of shops in London. Edmund Blackwood, as a solicitor, would have used such paper for important correspondence. He likely brought it specifically for their pact, wanting something that would lend weight and formality to their intentions. And the red wax that the waiter mentioned? Sealing wax, Holmes confirmed. Used to close the document after they had all signed, giving it the appearance of a legal contract. The 3 white candles provided light for the ceremony, but someone, probably Blackwood again, had brought red sealing wax to make their pact feel binding, official, irrevocable. They were creating theatre for themselves, Watson, transforming criminal conspiracy into something that felt noble and justified. Watson found himself thinking about the psychology of it. 3 men, presumably educated and respectable, working themselves into a state where murder seemed not only acceptable, but necessary. The wine would have helped, certainly, loosening inhibitions and amplifying grievances. But there must have been something more. Some shared understanding that the man they targeted had escaped justice through conventional means and therefore required unconventional punishment. "We still don't know who they intended to kill," Watson said. "Lestrade is investigating their histories, but surely there must be some indication in what remains of the document." Holmes shook his head slowly. The name, if it was ever written, was in a section that the fire consumed entirely. Deliberately, I suspect. The person who burnt this document wanted to preserve the conspirators' intentions and their mutual ignorance, but not the identity of their target. Why? Perhaps to protect that person's reputation, even in death. Or perhaps because revealing the name would make the entire situation too clear, would eliminate the mystery that has kept Thomas Weatherby paralyzed with fear rather than seeking official help. He crossed to the window and stood looking out at the fog-wrapped street, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. What we know is this: 3 men plotted to kill someone they all had reason to hate. Someone discovered their plot, warned them in writing. We have that threatening letter from Blackwood's desk, and then systematically eliminated 2 of them in ways that appeared accidental and self-inflicted. Now the 3rd conspirator is in hiding, and the burnt fragment of their pact has been sent to him as a reminder that someone knows everything, and that his turn is approaching. But is this person, the letter writer, the one who killed Blackwood and Ashford, is this vigilante justice or something else? Watson asked. Are they protecting the intended victim or enacting their own form of revenge? An excellent question, Holmes replied, turning back to face the room, and one that cannot be answered until we understand who the 3 were planning to kill. That is the key that unlocks everything else: motive, identity, methodology. Find the intended victim, and we find the killer. Or, perhaps... He paused, and Watson saw something flicker across his face. A thought forming, a connection being made, a possibility presenting itself that reshaped the entire puzzle. Or perhaps what? Watson prompted. Or perhaps, Holmes said slowly, we find that there is no killer at all. Consider, Watson, a left-handed man with a pistol in his right hand, a cautious solicitor stepping into traffic, both deaths ultimately accepted as accidental or self-inflicted. What if our mysterious correspondent didn't kill them directly, but instead created circumstances in which they killed themselves? What if the weapon was not violence, but psychology, guilt, fear, the weight of intention becoming unbearable? Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. You're suggesting that 2 men died of their own guilt? That merely planning a murder was sufficient to destroy them? I'm suggesting that Victorian morality is a peculiar thing, Watson. We live in an age that prizes propriety and conscience, that teaches men from childhood that thoughts are as significant as actions, that intention matters as much as deed. 3 men plotted murder, perhaps even convinced themselves briefly that they would carry it through, and then received a letter telling them their crime was known, their punishment inevitable. For some men, particularly those raised with a strong sense of moral responsibility, such knowledge could be devastating. He returned to his chair and picked up the fragment of the document, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger, as if it was something both precious and dangerous. Edmund Blackwood steps into traffic, his mind consumed by guilt or fear, his automatic caution overwhelmed by psychological distress. Nicholas Ashford left-handed but taking the pistol in his right hand. Why? Perhaps because in his final moments he was thinking of the murder he had planned, was holding the imaginary weapon as he would have held it to kill his intended victim, and the line between imagination and reality blurred sufficiently that he trailed off. But Watson understood the implication. A man so consumed by what he had intended to do that he enacted it upon himself, the psychology of guilt becoming literally self-destructive. But that would require someone with extraordinary understanding of human nature, Watson objected. Someone who could predict with accuracy how each man would react to threat and accusation. That's not merely criminal genius, Holmes. That's almost supernatural. Not supernatural, Holmes corrected gently. Merely observant. Someone who knew these three men well enough to understand their weaknesses, their fears, their particular vulnerabilities. Someone who could craft threats specific enough to prey upon individual psychology while appearing to come from a source with genuine power to harm them. The clock struck 11, its chimes seeming to emphasize the lateness of the hour and the darkness of the subject they were discussing. Watson found himself thinking about Thomas Weatherby, hiding somewhere in London's vast sprawl, jumping at shadows, wondering when his turn would come. The man had seemed genuinely terrified when he visited Baker Street, and with good reason. 2 of his companions were dead, and the burnt fragment he had received was a clear message that someone had neither forgiven nor forgotten their intended crime. "We must find Weatherby," Watson said firmly. "Whatever the truth of how Blackwood and Ashford died, he's clearly in danger. Even if the danger is primarily psychological, a man frightened enough can make fatal mistakes." "Agreed," Holmes said, rising with sudden decision. "Which is why, Watson, you and I will be spending tomorrow conducting a rather different sort of investigation. We need to find not only Weatherby, but also the identity of the man these 3 intended to kill. Lestrade is pursuing official channels, but I suspect the answer lies in their shared history. Something from their past, before London, before their professional lives diverged and scattered them to different parts of the city." He moved to his desk and began pulling out maps of London, marking them with pencil as he spoke. Weatherby mentioned he had moved lodgings 3 times in the past week. A man that desperate leaves traces, registrations at hotels, questions to landlords, purchases of necessities under assumed names, perhaps, but still following patterns. We will find him, Watson. And when we do, we will learn the full truth of what these 3 men planned, and who has taken it upon themselves to ensure that plans remain forever unfulfilled. Watson watched his friend work, plotting search patterns across the map with the precision of a general planning a campaign, and felt that familiar mixture of apprehension and excitement that accompanied their more serious cases. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their windows, a man was hiding, and another was hunting. The question was whether Holmes and Watson could unravel the threads of this peculiar tragedy before Thomas Weatherby added his name to the list of casualties. The burnt fragment lay on the table between them, its blackened edges curling like the fingers of a dead hand, and Watson found himself wondering what other secrets it still held, what truths the flames had obscured that might yet be coaxed back into visibility through chemistry and careful observation. The night pressed against the windows with patient persistence, and somewhere in London a clock was counting down toward another death, accidental, self-inflicted, or something far more carefully orchestrated than either term suggested. The game had entered a new phase, and the pieces were moving toward positions that none of them yet fully understood, but all of them could feel approaching, with a certainty of dawn following the longest night. Morning arrived with the grudging reluctance of a creditor collecting an unpleasant debt. The fog had finally lifted, replaced by a sky the colour of pewter that threatened rain without quite committing to it, and Baker Street awakened to the usual symphony of urban life. The rattle of milk carts, the cry of newspaper boys, the measured tread of clerks heading to offices where they would spend the day transforming life's chaos into orderly columns of figures and correspondence. Watson descended to find Holmes already dressed and consuming what appeared to be his first meal in 24 hours, toast and coffee taken standing at the window. His attention divided between the street below and a telegram that had arrived with the Morning Post. Mrs. Hudson had evidently forgiven the previous evening's chemical disruptions, as the breakfast laid out was particularly generous, suggesting either absolution or bribery for future tolerance. "Lestrade has sent word," Holmes announced without preamble, passing the telegram to Watson. "He's found something interesting in the histories of our 3 conspirators, something that connects them not to each other. We knew they were university friends, but to a 4th person, a man named Cornelius Blackthorne." Watson read the telegram while simultaneously attempting to butter toast, a feat of coordination that resulted in crumbs on the telegram and butter on his cuff. The message was characteristically terse. "Found common thread. C. Blackthorne, deceased 1892. Details at yard. Come immediately. L." "Deceased," Watson observed, setting down both telegram and toast. "So if this Blackthorne is the man they intended to kill, then they were plotting murder of a corpse," Holmes finished, a note of satisfaction in his voice, which adds a rather delicious layer of irony to an already ironic situation. 3 men conspiring to kill someone who was already dead. The question is, did they know? And if not, who did? They made their way to Scotland Yard, through streets that were unusually busy for mid-morning, the shops doing brisk trade, and the thoroughfares crowded with vehicles of every description. London in daylight was a different creature than London in fog, louder, more colourful, less forgiving of secrets that the darkness had hidden. The great engine of commerce and empire ground on with mechanical indifference to individual tragedies, and Watson found himself thinking how easy it would be to disappear in such a place, to become just another face in the endless procession of faces that made up the city's population. Lestrade met them in his cramped office, a space that seemed to shrink further each time Watson visited, as if the weight of unsolved cases were physically compressing the walls. The inspector looked as though he had slept about as much as Holmes, which was to say, not at all, and his desk was buried under papers, files, and what appeared to be several days' worth of teacups that Mrs. Lestrade, if such a person existed, would certainly have disposed of with extreme prejudice. "Cornelius Blackthorne," Lestrade began without preamble, pulling a file from the chaos with the unerring instinct of a man who knew where everything was, despite appearances suggesting otherwise. "Died 3 years ago at his home in Kensington. Natural causes, according to the death certificate. Heart failure. He was 63, lived alone after his wife passed, no children, owned a moderately successful import business, left his estate to various charities. And his connection to our three conspirators? Holmes prompted, settling into the chair opposite Lestrade's desk with the air of a man preparing for a lengthy briefing. That's where it gets interesting, Lestrade said, opening the file to reveal what appeared to be employment records and university documents. Blackthorne was a benefactor of sorts. He funded scholarships at Oxford, paid for promising young men from modest backgrounds to receive educations they couldn't otherwise afford. Blackwood, Ashford, and Weatherby were all recipients of his generosity between 1870 and 1874. Watson felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, though the picture they formed remained stubbornly unclear. So they knew him. He helped them. Why would they want him dead? Because, Holmes said quietly, his eyes scanning the documents Lestrade had spread before them. Benefactors are not always benevolent. Money given creates obligations, and obligations can become chains. Inspector, what else can you tell us about Blackthorne's character, his reputation? Were there any complaints, any suggestions of impropriety? Lestrade's expression grew uncomfortable, the look of a man about to discuss matters that Victorian sensibilities preferred to leave unspoken. Nothing official, nothing that ever reached the courts or even the newspapers. But I did some asking around, quietly, you understand, among men who knew him or worked with him. And the picture that emerged was complicated. He paused, selecting his words with the care of someone navigating a conversational minefield. Blackthorne was generous, yes, but his generosity came with expectations. He took a particular interest in the young men he sponsored, wanted regular reports on their progress, insisted on frequent meetings, demanded a level of intimacy in the relationship that some found uncomfortable. The unspoken implications hung in the air like smoke. Watson had seen enough of the world, both in his medical practice and his years with Holmes, to understand what Lestrade was delicately not saying. Victorian society had perfected the art of the euphemism, of discussing the unspeakable through carefully chosen words that said everything while appearing to say nothing at all. Did any of these young men ever complain formally? Holmes asked, his voice carefully neutral. No. And that's the problem, isn't it? Blackthorne was wealthy, influential, well-connected. The men he sponsored were from poor backgrounds, dependent on his money for their educations and their futures. Who would believe them if they complained? Who would risk offending a generous benefactor over what might be dismissed as misunderstanding or oversensitivity? Lestrade pulled out another document, a letter Watson saw, written in a hand he recognized as Edmund Blackwood's. I found this among Blackwood's personal papers after you visited his chambers yesterday. It's addressed to Nicholas Ashford, dated about 6 months ago. Read it, Mr. Holmes. It explains a great deal. Holmes took the letter and read aloud, his voice taking on the cadence of the text. My dear Nicholas, I received your letter with a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that I am not alone in my memories, that what I have carried for 20 years is not mere imagination or the distortion of youthful misunderstanding. Rage that he did to you what he did to me, and doubtless to others whose names we may never know. You ask if I have considered seeking legal redress. I have consulted with colleagues, discreetly, hypothetically, and the conclusion is always the same. Too much time has passed. There is no evidence beyond our testimony, and Blackthorne's reputation would protect him even if we could prove our claims. The law, it seems, is designed to protect men like him from accusations by men like us. I've been thinking of Weatherby. Do you remember how changed he was after that summer at Blackthorn's country house? How he withdrew from us? From everyone? I believe now that what happened to us happened to him as well, perhaps more severely. We should reach out to him, Nicholas. We should speak of this together, all three of us. Perhaps in sharing the burden, we might find some way to lighten it. Or perhaps, if the law will not give us justice, we must consider taking it ourselves. Your friend in suffering, Edmund. The silence that followed was profound. Watson felt his throat tighten with a mixture of anger and pity. Anger at Blackthorn for his abuse of power and trust, pity for the three young men whose lives had been shadowed by trauma they had carried in silence for decades. The Victorian age prided itself on propriety and moral rectitude, but beneath that polished surface lay rot that no amount of respectability could disguise. So they met at the Criterion, Holmes said slowly, not primarily to plot murder, but to finally speak of what had been done to them, to break the silence they had each maintained for 20 years. And in that speaking, in that shared acknowledgement, the idea of revenge took root and grew. Can you blame them? Watson heard himself say, his voice rougher than intended. The law failed them. Society failed them. Blackthorn destroyed something in each of them and faced no consequences. If they wanted justice. I don't blame them, Holmes interrupted gently. I understand them. But understanding doesn't alter the fact that they were planning murder, Watson. And someone else, someone who knew about Blackthorn, about what he had done, about what these three were planning, decided to intervene in a manner both subtle and devastating. Lestrade cleared his throat, a sound that suggested he had more uncomfortable information to share. There's another complication, Mr. Holmes. When I started asking questions about Blackthorn, I discovered that the 3 years since his death have been eventful for his reputation. Several men have come forward, not publicly, but in private correspondence to various authorities, claiming that Blackthorn had abused them during their youth, none willing to testify in court, all requesting anonymity. But the pattern is consistent and damning. How many men? Holmes asked sharply. At least 7 that I've been able to confirm, possibly more. All were recipients of Blackthorn's sponsorship between 1865 and 1880. All describe similar experiences, the excessive interest, the uncomfortable meetings, the violations that occurred under the guise of mentorship and care. Watson felt sick. 7 men, probably more, carrying scars that society preferred to ignore. Trauma that Victorian morality had no language to acknowledge or address. Blackwood, Ashford, and Weatherby were not isolated victims, but part of a pattern, a decades-long campaign of exploitation that Blackthorn had conducted under the protective cover of charity and respectability. Did these other men know each other? Holmes asked. Was there any communication between them, any attempt to organize or coordinate their accusations? Lestrade shook his head. Not that I can determine. Each came forward independently, often through intermediaries, priests, doctors, solicitors acting on their behalf. It's as if Blackthorn's death somehow gave them permission to speak, but even then, only in whispers to authorities who couldn't or wouldn't act on information about a dead man. Holmes rose and began to pace, his movements precise and controlled, each step marking a point in his deduction. But someone did act. someone who knew about Blackthorn's crimes, who knew about the 3 men planning belated revenge, who decided that justice, if it could be called that, would be served in a different manner entirely. "You think one of the other victims is behind this?" Watson asked. "One of the other men Blackthorn abused?" "It's certainly possible," Holmes replied. "Consider the psychology. A man who has carried trauma for years, who has watched his abuser die peacefully without ever facing consequences, who then learns that 3 others are planning violence against a corpse. Such a person might feel proprietary about revenge, might believe that if anyone has the right to punish Blackthorn's victims turned avengers, it should be another victim." "But Blackthorn is already dead," Watson objected. "How does killing the 3 men serve justice?" Holmes stopped pacing and turned to face them both, his expression grave. "Because perhaps, in the mind of our mysterious orchestrator, these 3 men weren't innocent victims planning justified revenge. Perhaps they waited too long, spoke too quietly, allowed Blackthorn to continue his predations while they remained silent. Perhaps someone believes that by their silence they share culpability for the suffering of those who came after them." The implications were staggering. Watson tried to imagine the mindset required to construct such logic, to see victim survivors as somehow complicit in their own abuse and the abuse of others, to believe that their belated attempt at justice warranted death rather than compassion. It was a labyrinth of moral complexity that made his head ache. "There's one more thing," Lestrade said, pulling out a final document. "I obtained Blackthorn's will. Most of his estate went to charities, as I mentioned. But there was one personal bequest, a substantial sum left to a young man who had been in his employ as a secretary during the final years of his life, a man named Adrian Whitmore." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "Tell me about Whitmore." "He's 32, educated but from modest circumstances, much like the scholarship recipients. Worked for Blackthorn for 5 years, before the old man's death. According to people I spoke with, he was devoted to Blackthorn, defended him vehemently against any hint of criticism, and took his death very hard. After the inheritance, he used the money to establish himself as a private tutor and translator, lives in Bloomsbury, keeps to himself mostly." "And was he one of Blackthorn's victims?" Watson asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Lestrade's expression was troubled. "I don't know. He's never made any complaint or accusation. But the pattern is there. Young man, modest background, older wealthy benefactor taking excessive interest. And there's something else. According to neighbors I spoke with, Whitmore has a peculiar habit. He collects newspaper clippings about accidents and suicides, keeps extensive files on what he calls the ironies of fate." Holmes returned to his chair, his fingers steepling in that characteristic pose that meant his mind was racing through possibilities, constructing and discarding theories at a speed that left mere mortals struggling to keep pace. "Inspector, I need everything you can find about Adrian Whitmore, his movements over the past month, his habits, his associations. And I need the addresses of the other victims who came forward, the 7 men you mentioned. We must determine if any of them might have reason and means to orchestrate what has happened." "You think Whitmore is our man?" Lestrade asked. "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that we are dealing with someone who understands psychology as well as methodology, who can predict behavior and manipulate circumstances with considerable skill, Whether that person is Whitmore or one of the other victims remains to be determined. But we are running out of time. Thomas Weatherby is still in hiding, still terrified, and if our theorist is correct about the psychological nature of these deaths, then Weatherby's fear may be the very weapon that destroys him. They spent the next hour reviewing files, making notes, mapping connections between names and dates and events that had seemed unrelated, but now formed a pattern, as clear as constellations to those who knew how to read the sky. Watson found himself simultaneously appalled by what Blackthorne had done, and troubled by the question of what constituted justice in such circumstances. The law had failed. Society had failed. And now men were dying. Not innocents, perhaps, but not guilty enough to warrant execution either. When they finally left Scotland Yard, the threatened rain had begun. Not the dramatic downpour that washed streets clean, but the persistent drizzle that London specialised in, the kind that soaked through clothing and spirits with equal efficiency. They walked in silence for several blocks, each lost in thoughts too complex to articulate, until Holmes finally spoke. "Watson, tell me something. If you had been in their position, young, vulnerable, betrayed by someone you trusted, and if years later you learned that your abuser had escaped all earthly justice, what would you do?" Watson considered the question carefully, mindful of its weight. "I would like to think I would find some way to heal, to move forward. But honestly, Holmes, I don't know. Trauma is not rational. Justice delayed is not the same as justice denied, but it often feels that way to those who have been wronged. If I had met others who shared my experience, if we had collectively decided that the system would not protect us, I might very well have made the same choice they did. And if," Holmes continued quietly, "someone then punished you for that choice, if another victim, one who perhaps suffered more or spoke louder, decided that your silence had made you complicit in their abuse." "That would be monstrous," Watson said firmly. "Victims are not responsible for their abusers' actions. Silence does not equal consent or complicity. Fear of speaking is not the same as choosing to enable harm." "I agree," Holmes said, "but I suspect our killer does not. And that is what makes this case so particularly tragic. It is victims destroying victims, each believing they hold some moral high ground that justifies eliminating others who failed to meet their standard of resistance or revenge." They turned onto Baker Street as the drizzle intensified, and Watson found himself grateful for the prospect of dry clothes and hot tea, small comforts against the darkness they were investigating. Somewhere in London, Adrian Whitmore was going about his day, teaching Latin to board students perhaps, or translating documents from languages most Londoners would never speak. And somewhere else, Thomas Weatherby was hiding, jumping at shadows, waiting for death to find him in whatever form it had found his friends. The game had entered its final phase, Watson realized. All the pieces were on the board, all the players identified, or nearly so. What remained was the endgame, finding Weatherby before fear destroyed him, confronting whoever had orchestrated these deaths, and determining what justice even meant in a situation where everyone was both victim and victimizer, where every hand was stained and every conscience compromised. Holmes paused at the door to 220 Woolby and looked up at the grey sky, with an expression Watson couldn't quite read. "Tonight, Watson, we will find Thomas Weatherby, and tomorrow we will discover whether we are chasing a murderer or simply a very patient student of human psychology who has learned to weaponize guilt and fear as effectively as any poison or blade. They climbed the 17 steps to their rooms, leaving wet footprints on Mrs. Hudson's carpet that would certainly earn them a lecture, and Watson found himself hoping that when they found the answers they were seeking, those answers would provide clarity, rather than simply more questions, more moral ambiguities, more evidence that justice in Victorian London was as much an illusion as the gaslit shadows that danced on fog-wrapped streets. The rain had settled into that peculiarly English rhythm, neither storm nor drizzle, but something persistent and melancholic that seemed designed to match the mood of the investigation, rather than any meteorological purpose. Holmes spent the afternoon in what Watson had come to recognize as his hunting mode. Telegrams dispatched with cryptic instructions, messages sent through street Arabs who materialized at Baker Street like conjured spirits, and correspondence with individuals whose names Watson recognized from previous cases as occupying that shadowy realm between legitimate inquiry and outright illegality. By evening, Holmes had assembled what he called their trap, though Watson privately thought it resembled less a trap and more an educated guess wrapped in determination and sprinkled with hope. They were to visit 3 locations where Weatherby might conceivably be hiding: cheap lodging houses, in areas where a man with funds, but requiring anonymity, might disappear into the great unwashed mass of London's transient population. The first 2 yielded nothing but suspicious landlords and rooms that smelled of mildew, desperation, and the particular sadness of lives lived in temporary spaces. But the third, a narrow house in Whitechapel that leaned against its neighbours like a drunk seeking support, produced a reaction from the landlady that Holmes recognized immediately. The woman's eyes had widened fractionally when Holmes described Weatherby, and her denial had come too quickly, too emphatically, carrying the unmistakable scent of a lie told in service of discretion or fear. "He's here," Holmes murmured as they retreated from the doorstep, the landlady's protests following them into the rain-slicked street. "3rd floor, I suspect," based on where her eyes flickered. "The room with the window facing the alley. Easy egress if one needed to flee quickly." They positioned themselves in a doorway across the street, sheltered from the rain, but exposed to the bone-deep cold that November brought to London's poorer districts. Watson pulled his collar up and tried not to think about his warm chair at Baker Street, the fire that would be crackling cheerfully by now, the brandy that Mrs. Hudson would have left on the sideboard. Instead, he watched the building's grimy windows and waited with the patience that years alongside Holmes had cultivated in him. An hour passed, then another. The street gradually emptied as even those with nowhere better to go sought whatever shelter they could find against the worsening weather. Gas lamps created pools of uncertain light that the rain fragmented into patterns that shifted and reformed with hypnotic regularity. Then, movement. A shadow at the 3rd floor window, brief, furtive, the silhouette of someone checking the street below with the paranoia of the hunted. Holmes tensed beside Watson, his hand moving to Watson's arm in a silent signal to remain still, to watch, rather than act. The front door opened, and a figure emerged, muffled in a heavy coat, hat pulled low, moving with the jerky uncertainty of someone who expected attack from any direction. Thomas Weatherby, Watson recognized, though the man had aged a decade in the few days since his visit to Baker Street. His face, glimpsed briefly in the gaslight, was haggard, eyes darting like a cornered animal seeking escape routes. Holmes waited until Weatherby had moved 20 paces down the street before following, maintaining distance with the skill of someone who had tracked quarry through half of London. Watson fell into step beside him, and together they shadowed Weatherby through a maze of narrow streets and cramped alleys, following him deeper into Whitechapel's labyrinthine heart. Weatherby walked with purpose now, his initial caution giving way to something resembling determination. He turned corners sharply, doubled back twice, checking for followers, Watson realized, and finally entered a public house called the Hanged Man, an establishment whose name promised nothing good, and whose appearance delivered on that promise with enthusiastic squalor. Holmes and Watson waited 5 minutes before following him inside. The pub was dim, crowded, thick with tobacco smoke and the mingled scents of spilled beer and unwashed humanity. Perfect anonymity, Watson thought. A place where no one looked too closely at anyone else, where questions were not asked and secrets were currency more reliable than coin. Weatherby sat alone in a corner booth, a glass of something amber before him, his hands wrapped around it as if seeking warmth from the liquid within. Holmes approached with Watson following, and when Weatherby looked up and saw them, his expression cycled through surprise, fear, and finally a kind of weary resignation. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice barely audible above the pub's din, "I suppose I should have known you would find me, though I'm not certain whether to thank you or curse you for the effort." Holmes slid into the booth opposite Weatherby, and Watson took position at the end, blocking escape while appearing casual. "You've been avoiding me, Mr. Weatherby. A curious choice for a man who came seeking my help less than a week ago." Weatherby laughed, a sound without humour that was more exhalation than expression of mirth. "I came seeking help against an external threat, Mr. Holmes. I didn't realize the greatest danger was internal. My own mind, my own guilt, my own memories conspiring to destroy me more efficiently than any outside assassin." "You know how Blackwood and Ashford died," Holmes said. "It was not a question. I know what the official reports say, accident and suicide. But I also know that neither man would have died in those ways unless something had driven them to it. Edmund was terrified of traffic. His father's death had marked him permanently. And Nicholas, taking a pistol in his right hand when he was left-handed from birth. No. Someone or something pushed them toward those deaths as surely as if they had wielded the weapons themselves." Watson leaned forward slightly. "You received the threatening letter as well, the one warning that you would all pay for your intentions." Weatherby's eyes widened. "How did you—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Of course. You found Edmund's copy. Yes, I received a letter. 3 days before we met at the Criterion, actually. It told me that my plans were known, that justice would be served regardless of whether I acted on my intentions. I dismissed it as empty threat, the ranting of someone who had discovered our correspondence and sought to frighten us. I was a fool. The letter came from someone who knew about Cornelius Blackthorne," Holmes said, watching Weatherby's face carefully. "Someone who knew what he had done to you and the others. Someone who perhaps suffered similarly and believes that your silence, your failure to speak out sooner, makes you complicit in the abuse of those who came after you." Weatherby's composure cracked, his face contorting with pain that was clearly not physical. "You know about Blackthorne, then? About what he did?" "God, I've carried that poison for 20 years, Holmes. 20 years of shame and rage and wondering if I could have stopped it, should have fought harder, should have spoken louder. Do you know what it's like to be violated by someone who presents themselves as benefactor? To have your trust, your hope, your very future used as leverage for abuse? I cannot imagine, Holmes said quietly, and Watson heard genuine sympathy in his friend's voice. A rarity, for Holmes typically kept emotional distance from the human wreckage they encountered. But I know that you are not responsible for Blackthorn's actions, nor for the silence that trauma imposed upon you. Aren't I, though? Weatherby's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby patrons before he controlled himself, dropping back to a harsh whisper. Nicholas and we compared experiences after Edmund's letter brought us together. We realized that there were others, men we'd known at university who had also received Blackthorn's patronage, who had also changed afterward, become withdrawn or self-destructive, or simply disappeared into lives smaller than they had seemed destined for. We knew Holmes. Perhaps we didn't know the specific details, but we knew something was wrong, and we said nothing. Because you were victims yourself, Watson interjected, unable to remain silent. Because trauma does not come with an instruction manual for how to heal or fight back. Because the society we live in provides no language for what happened to you, no framework for seeking justice against men of wealth and influence. Pretty words, Doctor, Weatherby said bitterly. But they don't change the mathematics. We were silent. Others suffered. And when we finally decided to act, it was too late. Blackthorn had been dead for 3 years. Our grand revenge was against a corpse. Do you understand how that felt? To finally gather the courage to seek justice, only to discover that even that had been taken from us. Holmes steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. But someone else knew. Someone who had access to your pact, your signed document. Someone who decided that if you couldn't have your revenge against Blackthorn, you would serve as proxies for his punishment. Tell me, Mr. Weatherby, at the Criterion, after you had all signed the document, did anyone else enter the room? Did you leave the paper unattended at any point? Weatherby frowned, reaching back through memory, clouded by wine and emotion. Edmund went to fetch more brandy at one point. He left the room, was gone perhaps 5 minutes. Nicholas and I remained, but we were distracted, arguing about methods, about timing. The paper was on the table between us, but we weren't watching it specifically. Someone could have entered through the service door. There's one in all the private rooms, for the staff. Could have read what we'd written, perhaps even added to it. The fourth hand, Watson murmured, and Weatherby looked at him sharply. There was a fourth hand? Someone else wrote on our pact? Holmes produced a photograph of the burnt fragment, one of the detailed images he had created, showing the traces of that mysterious fourth inscription. Someone added an observation that all 3 of you sought the same man, planned the same death, but were blind to something. The fire destroyed the rest, but the implication is clear. Someone wanted you to know that your conspiracy was known, understood, and judged. Weatherby stared at the photograph, his face draining of what little colour it had possessed. Then they've been watching from the beginning, waiting, killing Edmund and Nicholas in ways that looked innocent but weren't. And now they're waiting for me to... what? Kill myself out of guilt? Go mad from fear? Make some fatal mistake that will let them add my death to their tally? Possibly, Holmes agreed. though I suspect the methodology is more subtle than simple murder. The killer, if we can even call them that, is using psychology as their weapon, creating circumstances in which guilt and fear do the actual killing, while they merely observe and perhaps provide the occasional push toward the precipice. Adrian Whitmore, Weatherby said suddenly, the name emerging like a revelation. It has to be Adrian Whitmore. Holmes's eyes sharpened. You know Whitmore. We all knew him in a way. He was Blackthorne's final project. Took him in, employed him, made him his heir. We used to wonder if Adrian had suffered the same fate we had, but he seemed so devoted to Blackthorne, so defensive of him. After Blackthorne died, Adrian appeared at my office one day, said he knew I had been one of Blackthorne's scholarship boys, wanted to talk about the old man's legacy. I refused. Couldn't bear the thought of discussing Blackthorne with his devoted acolyte. But Adrian kept coming back, persistent. Finally left me a note saying that silence was complicity, that those who protected monsters by staying quiet were as guilty as the monsters themselves. Watson felt pieces clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a well-constructed mechanism. He blamed you, not for what Blackthorne did, but for not stopping him, not speaking out, not preventing him from abusing others, including possibly Whitmore himself. That's the bitter irony, isn't it? Weatherby said, something like hysteria creeping into his voice. If Adrian was abused, then he's a victim too. But somehow, in his mind, his victimhood is pure, while ours is tainted by silence. He sees himself as the righteous avenger, punishing those who failed to save him by failing to save themselves loudly enough. Holmes rose abruptly, decision crystallizing in his manner. We need to move quickly. Mr. Weatherby, you will return with Dr. Watson to Baker Street, where you will remain under his protection. I am going to visit Mr. Adrian Whitmore, and we will settle this matter before another death, accidental, suicidal, or otherwise, adds itself to this tragedy's accounting. You think he'll confess? Watson asked, standing as well. I think he'll want to explain, Holmes corrected. There's a particular psychology to the righteous killer. They don't merely want their victims dead. They want them to understand why they're dying, to acknowledge their guilt, to validate the killer's moral framework. Whitmore has been patient, methodical, theatrical even. He won't be able to resist the opportunity to justify his actions to someone who fully understands what he's done. They emerged from the pub into rain that had intensified, the kind of downpour that turned London's streets into rivers and made navigation treacherous. Watson took charge of Weatherby, who had the deflated appearance of a man who had been running on fear alone and had finally exhausted even that bitter fuel. Holmes disappeared into the night with characteristic abruptness, leaving Watson to navigate their way back to Baker Street with a man who flinched at every shadow and seemed to expect death to reach for him from every darkened doorway. By the time they reached 221B, Weatherby was shaking. From cold, fear, or exhaustion, Watson couldn't determine and suspected it was all three. Mrs. Hudson, roused from her evening routine, took one look at their bedraggled state and immediately set about preparing hot tea and finding dry clothes with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to the irregular hours and irregular guests that Holmes's profession demanded. Watson settled Weatherby in his own chair by the fire, draped a blanket around his shoulders, and poured a measure of brandy into the tea. Medicinal, he told himself, though he suspected the comfort was as much psychological as physical. Weatherby held the cup in trembling hands and stared into the flames as if seeking answers in their dance. "I should have spoken," he said quietly, almost to himself. Not for justice, not for revenge, but simply to speak, to break the silence that Blackthorn imposed on us. Perhaps, if I had, Edmund and Nicholas would still be alive. Perhaps Adrian wouldn't have become whatever he's become. Or perhaps, Watson said gently, sitting opposite him, you would have been ignored, dismissed, socially destroyed, and accomplished nothing except your own ruin. Victorian society is not kind to men who make accusations against their betters, particularly accusations of this nature. The shame falls on the victim, not the victimizer. You know this. Knowing it doesn't make it easier, Weatherby replied, doesn't make the guilt less, doesn't bring back my friends or restore the years we lost to shame and silence. Watson had no answer to that. He was a doctor, trained to fix bodies, and found himself consistently frustrated by his inability to similarly repair minds and spirits. Trauma was not a wound that sutures could close, and no amount of rational argument seemed sufficient to lift the weight of unearned guilt that victims so often carried. They sat in silence, listening to the rain assault the windows, and the fire crackle its counterpoint, while somewhere across London, Holmes was confronting a man who had turned his own victimhood into a weapon, who had decided that if he could not punish his abuser, he would punish those who had failed to be the heroes he needed them to be. The clock ticked toward midnight, marking the passage of time with mechanical indifference, and Watson found himself hoping that when Holmes returned, he would bring with him answers that made sense of this tragedy. But, increasingly, he suspected that some things defied sense, that the human capacity for suffering, and the equally human capacity for inflicting it on others, operated according to logics that reason could not fully encompass. The game was reaching its endgame, and Watson could only hope that the final moves would bring resolution rather than simply more victims, more grief, more evidence that justice in this world was a thing more often imagined than achieved. Holmes returned to Baker Street, near 2 a.m, soaked through and carrying an expression Watson had learned to read as the complex mixture of intellectual satisfaction and human disappointment, the look of a man who had solved a puzzle only to discover that the solution provided no comfort to anyone involved. He shed his waterlogged coat in the hallway, climbed the 17 steps with the heaviness of fatigue, and entered the sitting room where Watson and Weatherby waited, in that peculiar state of exhausted vigilance that comes from hours of anticipating news that one simultaneously needs and dreads to hear. "It's over," Holmes said without preamble, accepting the towel Mrs. Hudson materialized with. She had been hovering in her dressing gown, Watson realized, waiting with them, though she would never admit to such sentiment. Adrian Whitmore has confessed after a fashion, though whether what he confessed to constitutes murder in any legal sense remains debatable. Weatherby straightened in his chair, the blanket falling from his shoulders. He killed Edmund and Nicholas. He admitted it. He admitted to creating circumstances in which they killed themselves, Holmes corrected, settling into his chair with a weariness that suggested the evening's confrontation had cost him more than mere physical energy. Which is rather different, legally speaking, though morally the distinction may be meaningless. Would you like the full accounting, or merely the essentials? Everything, Weatherby said, his voice carrying the firmness of someone who had decided that whatever pain knowledge brought, It was preferable to the torture of imagination. I need to understand. I need to know why my friends are dead. Holmes steepled his fingers, gathering his thoughts, and began to speak in that measured, analytical tone he adopted when reconstructing events for Watson's chronicles. Though this story, Watson suspected, would never be written for public consumption. Some tragedies were too complex, too painful, too revealing of societal failures to be reduced to entertainment. Adrian Whitmore is 32 years old, Holmes began, and has been carrying trauma of his own for nearly half that time. He was 17 when Cornelius Blackthorne took him as a secretary, fresh from a minor public school where he had been a scholarship student. Much like yourselves, Mr. Weatherby, though a decade later. Blackthorne's pattern, it seems, remained consistent across decades. The wealthy benefactor, the vulnerable young man, the abuse of power disguised as mentorship. Watson watched Weatherby's face as Holmes spoke, saw the recognition there, the painful acknowledgement of shared experience, the understanding that Adrian had walked a path they knew too well. But Adrian, Holmes continued, responded differently than you three did. Where you retreated into silence and carried your trauma privately, Adrian transformed his into devotion. He convinced himself that what Blackthorne did was not abuse, but favor. Not violation, but privilege. It's a psychological mechanism not uncommon among those who cannot face the full horror of their exploitation. They reframe it as something else, something they chose or earned or even deserved. Stockholm Syndrome, Watson murmured, using a term he had read in recent medical literature describing hostages who developed attachment to their captors. Precisely. Adrian became Blackthorne's most devoted servant, his defender, his heir. He genuinely mourned when the old man died, felt himself orphaned and bereft. But then, Holmes paused, his expression darkening. Then other men began to speak, not publicly, not with names attached, but whispers reached Adrian that others had suffered, that Blackthorne had a pattern, that Adrian wasn't special or chosen, but merely one among many victims, and that shattered his carefully constructed illusion. Weatherby leaned forward, his hands clenched together so tightly the knuckles showed white. So he turned his devotion into rage. More complex than that, Holmes said. Adrian's rage was not primarily directed at Blackthorne. His mind still could not fully accept that his beloved mentor was a predator. Instead, his rage focused on those who, in his view, had allowed Blackthorne to continue his depredations through their silence. He began to research, to identify every man who had received Blackthorne's sponsorship, to track their lives and careers. And what he found was successful men, solicitors, businessmen, professionals who had survived their trauma, built lives, achieved the futures that Blackthorne's money had purchased for them. While saying nothing, Watson said quietly, understanding dawning, while protecting their own reputations and careers at the expense of warning others. Exactly. In Adrian's mind, every man who remained silent after his own abuse became complicit in the abuse that followed. Each one who accepted Blackthorne's money and kept his secrets enabled the monster to continue hunting. Adrian convinced himself that he was the only pure victim, because he had not remained silent in his own way, had stayed close to Blackthorne, had been there at the end. In his twisted logic, proximity equaled honesty, while distance equaled cowardice and complicity. Holmes rose and crossed to his desk, returning with papers that Watson recognized as telegrams and letters received throughout the evening. When Adrian learned that 3 of Blackthorn's former protégés were meeting to discuss their shared trauma, and possibly to plot revenge against a man already 3 years dead, he saw it as the ultimate hypocrisy. They had waited until it was safe, until Blackthorn could face no earthly consequences, until their belated courage cost them nothing, and he decided to teach them the lesson they had failed to teach themselves. "How did he know about our meeting?" Weatherby asked. "How did he know what we planned?" "He was there," Holmes said simply, "at the Criterion. He had been following Edmund Blackwood for weeks, watching him, waiting for something. When he saw all 3 of you gather at a restaurant known for discreet, private rooms, he bribed a waiter for information, learned you had requested complete privacy, and positioned himself where he could observe. The service door to the Marlborough room was not locked, a security oversight he exploited. While you were distracted during Edmund's absence, Adrian slipped in, read what you had written, and added his own observation. Then he left and began planning how to make each of you pay for what he perceived as your sin of silence." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He stalked them, studied them, learned their fears and weaknesses. Meticulously, Adrian has a gift for observation, perhaps not at my level, but considerable nonetheless. He watched Edmund for weeks, learned about his father's death and his resulting terror of traffic. He noted Edmund's habits, his routes, his patterns. And then, one afternoon, when Edmund was walking a familiar path, Adrian appeared on the opposite side of the street, wearing a coat and hat that resembled what Cornelius Blackthorn had favoured, just stood there, watching. Weatherby made a sound like a sob or a laugh. Watson couldn't tell which. Edmund saw him, thought he saw Blackthorn's ghost, and stepped into traffic without looking, Holmes confirmed. Adrian didn't push him, didn't touch him, simply stood where Edmund would see him, knowing that a mind already consumed by guilt and fear would fill in the rest. The hansom cab did the actual killing, but Adrian provided the fatal distraction. "That's murder," Watson said firmly. "Perhaps not by traditional means, but murder nonetheless." "Is it?" Holmes asked, and Watson heard genuine philosophical inquiry in the question. Adrian created a circumstance. Edmund's own trauma, his own guilt, his own psychology did the rest. In court, Adrian would argue that he was merely standing on a street corner, that he couldn't control how Edmund reacted to seeing him. There's no law against resembling a dead man, no statute that makes it criminal to appear unexpectedly in someone's line of sight. And Nicholas Ashford? Weatherby's voice was hoarse. How did Adrian kill him? Holmes's expression grew darker still. That was more direct, though still remarkably subtle. Adrian befriended Nicholas, presented himself as another of Blackthorn's victims, shared false confidences, built trust. Then, during one of their meetings, he spoke at length about guilt and responsibility, about how some sins were so great that the only honourable response was self-destruction. He painted Nicholas into a psychological corner where suicide seemed like the only honourable course. Then he provided the means, left his own pistol where Nicholas would find it, told him where to place it for maximum efficiency. And Nicholas, left-handed but following Adrian's right-handed demonstration, did exactly as instructed. The silence that followed was profound. Watson found himself struggling with the horror of it. Not the violence of traditional murder, but this cold, calculated manipulation of traumatized men into destroying themselves. It was murder by psychology, assassination by suggestion, and perhaps more evil for its subtlety than any blade or poison could have been. He was going to do the same to me, Weatherby said, and it was not a question. Befriend me, manipulate me, guide me toward my own death while keeping his hands clean. Undoubtedly, though your visit to me complicated his plans, Adrian has been watching Baker Street, waiting to see what you would do next. My intervention forced him to accelerate his timeline, to become impatient. That's why I was able to find him. Impatience breeds carelessness, and carefulness was what had protected him thus far. Weatherby stood abruptly, pacing to the window, where rain still streaked the glass like tears. What happens now? You said he confessed. To what, exactly? If he didn't physically kill them, if he merely created circumstances, what crime can he be charged with? Holmes's expression was grave. That is the unfortunate complexity of this case. I have taken a full statement from Adrian, documented his methods and motivations. But proving criminal culpability will be nearly impossible. He touched neither victim. Both deaths were ruled accidental or self-inflicted before I even entered the case. Any prosecution would have to prove that Adrian's actions directly caused their deaths, and defense counsel would argue that traumatized men with guilty consciences made their own choices. So he gets away with it, Weatherby said bitterly. He murders 2 men and faces no consequences. Another monster protected by the inadequacy of law. Not quite, Holmes said, and something in his tone made Watson look at him sharply. I have made certain arrangements. Adrian Whitmore's full confession, his detailed methodology and documentation of Cornelius Blackthorne's decades of abuse have been provided to several parties. Journalists who specialize in exposing social corruption, solicitors who represent victims' advocacy groups, medical professionals who study the psychological aftermath of trauma. Adrian will face no criminal charges, perhaps, but he will face public exposure. His name will be associated with manipulation and psychological murder. His reputation, such as it is, will be destroyed as thoroughly as he destroyed your friends. And Blackthorne's reputation? Weatherby asked. Will that finally be destroyed as well? Will people finally know what he was? They will know, Holmes confirmed. The full scope of his abuse, the number of his victims, the decades of exploitation disguised as charity, all of it will become public record. His name will be synonymous with hypocrisy and predation. It's not justice, precisely, but it's acknowledgement. The silence that protected him in life will be broken in death. Watson watched Weatherby process this information, saw the complex emotions playing across his face, relief, anger, grief, and something that might have been the first tentative emergence of peace. And the other victims, the 7 men Lestrade identified, and however many more exist. They will be offered resources, Holmes said. Medical treatment, legal counsel if they choose to pursue civil action against Blackthorne's estate, and most importantly, community. One of the advocacy groups I've contacted specializes in connecting survivors of similar trauma, helping them understand they are not alone, that their silence was not cowardice but survival. If you wish, Mr. Weatherby, I can arrange for you to be included in those introductions. Weatherby turned from the window, and Watson saw that his face was wet. Whether from tears or simply rain transferred from the glass, he couldn't say and wouldn't ask. 20 years, Weatherby said quietly. 20 years I've carried this alone, convinced that speaking would destroy me more surely than silence. And now you're telling me there are others, that I could have had support, community, understanding all along. You could have, Holmes agreed gently. But you also could have been destroyed. Victorian society is not kind to men who reveal such vulnerabilities, who admit to such violations. The risk of speaking was real, the potential cost genuine. You made the choice that felt safest, and that is nothing to be ashamed of. But Edmund and Nicholas are still dead, Weatherby said, and I'm alive because you intervened. If you hadn't, Adrian would have manipulated me the same way, and I would have followed my friends into whatever darkness they found. Perhaps, Holmes acknowledged, or perhaps your fear, your caution, your willingness to seek help would have protected you. We cannot know. What we can know is that you are alive now, and you have the opportunity to choose how you move forward. You can remain trapped in guilt and what might have been, or you can begin the difficult work of healing while honoring your friends' memories by speaking the truth they carried in silence for so long. The clock struck 3, its chimes seeming to mark not just the hour, but a transition, from investigation to resolution, from mystery to understanding, from the questions that had driven the case to the more difficult questions of what came after. Watson rose and poured brandy for all 3 of them, the ritual of glass and liquid providing structure to a moment that threatened to become too emotionally complex to navigate. To Edmund Blackwood and Nicholas Ashford, Holmes said, raising his glass, may they find in death the peace that eluded them in life. They drank in silence, and Watson tasted the bitterness of the liquor mixing with the bitterness of a case that had no satisfying resolution, only the acknowledgement that justice sometimes consisted of nothing more than ensuring that truth was finally spoken, that silence was finally broken, that monsters were finally named even if they could not be punished. There's one more thing, Holmes said, setting down his glass. The burnt fragment that Adrian sent you. I've analysed it completely. The final words that the fire obscured, the ones I couldn't initially decipher, I've now reconstructed. Would you like to know what they were? Weatherby nodded, steeling himself for one more revelation. Holmes pulled out the photograph he had been working on for days and read the complete 4th-hand inscription. All 3 seek the same man. All 3 plan the same death. All 3 are blind to the fact that vengeance has already been taken. Blackthorne died knowing his sins had been exposed to one who would ensure no one else suffered. The debt is paid. Let it end here. Watson felt understanding wash over him like cold water. Adrian exposed Blackthorne before he died, confronted him with his crimes. And perhaps that confrontation contributed to Blackthorne's fatal heart failure, Holmes said. Adrian has convinced himself that he killed his abuser, not with violence, but with truth, with the psychological burden of exposure and shame. In his mind, he had already achieved the revenge that you 3 were belatedly planning. Your pact was not only futile, it was an insult to Adrian's claimed victory, a suggestion that what he had done was insufficient. So he killed us for trying to kill a man he believed he had already killed, Weatherby said, and there was something almost like hysterical laughter in his voice. The irony is almost unbearable. Irony, Holmes agreed, seems to be the defining characteristic of this entire tragedy. 3 men seeking revenge against a corpse, a 4th man seeking revenge against avengers for planning a revenge he believed he had already achieved. and all of it built on a foundation of abuse that should never have occurred, silence that should never have been necessary, and a social structure that protected predators while abandoning victims. Dawn was beginning to press against the windows now, the rain having finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky the colour of bruised plums that promised a grey day to follow the grey night. Watson found himself profoundly weary, not just physically, but spiritually, exhausted by the weight of human suffering and human cruelty that this case had revealed. "What will you do now, Mr. Weatherby?" Holmes asked. "Return to your life, your work, your routine, or will you take the opportunity to speak, to connect with other survivors, to transform your private pain into something that might prevent others from suffering similarly?" Weatherby was silent for a long moment, staring into his brandy glass as if it might contain answers. "I don't know," he finally said. "I honestly don't know if I have the courage for that. But I know I can't go back to silence, can't pretend this didn't happen, or that Edmund and Nicholas died for nothing. They deserve to be remembered, and Blackthorne deserves to be known for what he truly was." "Then start there," Holmes suggested. "Tell their stories, tell your own, not publicly if you're not ready, but to someone, a doctor, a priest, a friend. Break the silence in whatever way feels possible, and build from there." As the sun finally managed to penetrate London's perpetual veil of smoke and cloud, painting the sitting room in shades of amber and shadow, Watson found himself thinking about all the stories that never got told, all the tragedies that played out in silence, all the victims who carried their pain alone because society had given them no other option. This case wouldn't be recorded in his chronicles, would not become another adventure of Sherlock Holmes for public entertainment. But perhaps that was appropriate. Some stories were not meant for entertainment, but for witnessing. Not for solving, but for acknowledging. Weatherby departed as morning fully established itself, leaving with addresses of advocacy groups and medical professionals, with the burden of his friends' deaths still heavy on his shoulders, but perhaps fractionally lighter than when he had arrived. Holmes watched him go with an expression Watson couldn't quite read. Satisfaction at having prevented a third death, perhaps, or frustration at the limitations of justice in cases where law and morality diverged so dramatically. "You did everything you could," Watson said quietly. "You saved his life and ensured that the truth would be known. That's more than most men could have accomplished." "I solved a puzzle," Holmes corrected. "I prevented a death. But I did not provide justice for Edmund Blackwood or Nicholas Ashford, did not undo the decades of abuse that Cornelius Blackthorne inflicted, did not repair the broken mechanism that allows such predators to flourish while their victims suffer in silence. I addressed symptoms while the disease continues untreated." "Then we continue treating symptoms," Watson said firmly, "until someone wiser than us discovers a cure. We do what we can, Holmes, and we don't apologize for the limitations of our power. You saved a man's life tonight. That matters." Holmes turned from the window and managed a slight smile, genuine, if tired. "You're right, of course. Though I suspect I'll need several days of chemistry experiments and violin practice to purge my system of this particular case's residue. The complexity of human psychology is infinitely more frustrating than the complexity of crime." "Because crime has rules," Watson suggested. "Human suffering does not." "Precisely." They settled into their respective chairs as Mrs. Hudson appeared with breakfast, her way of acknowledging the long night and expressing concern without resorting to something so undignified as actually saying so. The bacon was precisely cooked, the eggs perfectly done, the toast warm, but not burnt. Small comforts against the knowledge of tragedies that could not be prevented, injustices that could not be fully addressed, and the persistent failure of a society that prized appearances over truth and protected power over innocence. The case of the Candlelight Pact was closed, Watson thought, but its echoes would remain. In Thomas Weatherby's continued struggle toward healing, in Adrian Whitmore's public exposure and private torment, in the revelation of Cornelius Blackthorne's decades of predation, and in the memories of two men who had died not from external violence, but from the internal weight of trauma carried too long in silence. The fog had lifted from London streets, but the shadows remained, shadows that would always remain, because some darkness could not be entirely dispelled by gaslight or reason, or even the considerable genius of Sherlock Holmes. All that could be done was to name the darkness, to shine whatever light was available into its depths, and to offer what comfort could be found to those who had survived its embrace. And so Baker Street settled into its morning routine, while across London, in 1,000 rooms and 1,000 hearts, other survivors carried other silences, waiting for the courage or the catalyst that might finally allow them to speak. The game was over, but the larger struggle continued, as it always had, as it always would, until society learned to protect its vulnerable as vigilantly as it protected its powerful. But that, Watson thought, was a revolution for another day. For now, there was breakfast and warmth and the quiet satisfaction of having done what good could be done in an imperfect world. Sometimes that had to be enough.